They think fear will bring us crawling back, but baby, we learned something these past few years. Survival don't mean surrender, and loyalty without respect is just another word for captivity. Good people, let me tell you something that's been sitting heavy on my spirit lately, something that needs to be said out loud where everybody can hear it. There's a peculiar kind of arrogance floating through the corridors of democratic power right now. The assumption so bold it almost takes your breath away. They believe deep in their bones that if they stand back and let the storms come, if they allow the threats to mount and the attacks to intensify, we'll forget everything that's happened and come running back into their arms like we got nowhere else to go. But see, that's where they miscalculated. That's where they fundamentally misunderstood who we've become. Let me paint you a picture of what's really happening here, because this story is older than any of us and yet brand new in its audacity. The Democratic establishment has convinced itself that it holds a monopoly on our survival. That protection is something they can offer or withhold based on our behavior, our compliance, our willingness to fall in line without question or critique. They've watched communities of color, working class folks, young people, and marginalized populations show up election after election, pouring our hope and our power into their campaigns, and somewhere along the way, they stopped seeing us as partners in democracy and started seeing us as dependents. That's a dangerous transformation, family. That's the moment when alliance becomes assumption. Now here's where it gets really interesting, where the psychology reveals itself in all its calculated coldness. There's a strategy being deployed, whether conscious or unconscious, that operates on a simple premise. Create enough fear, allow enough chaos, stand back just far enough, and people will beg for the protection you're withholding. It's an old game, one that's been played in households and nations throughout history. Abusers know it well. You withdraw care, you permit harm, you position yourself as the only shield against worse dangers, and then you wait for desperation to do its work. But desperation has a twin sister, and her name is clarity. What they didn't count on is that we've been studying too. We've been watching how promises evaporate between election cycles, how urgency disappears once votes are counted, how our crises become their talking points until the cameras turn off. We've been taking notes on who shows up when there's nothing to gain, who fights when the polls say it's risky, who remembers our names when we're not needed. And let me tell you something about patterns. Once you see them clearly, you can't unsee them. Once you understand the game, you can't pretend you don't know the rules. The assumption that we'll run back reveals something deeper than political strategy. It exposes a fundamental misunderstanding of resilience, of dignity, of what happens to people when they realize they've been taken for granted. There's this moment, you see, this crystallizing moment when you understand that someone's protection comes with strings attached. When you realize that safety offered conditionally is really just control wearing a compassionate mask. And in that moment, something shifts. The fear doesn't disappear, but it gets company. It sits down next to anger, next to self-respect, next to a question that changes everything. What if we stopped waiting for someone else to save us and started building our own lifeboats? Now, I'm not saying there's no difference between political parties, no distinction between visions of America's future. That would be naive, and we're way past naive, baby. But I am saying this. There's a difference between strategic voting and self-abandonment. There's a difference between choosing the better option and pretending that option has earned unwavering devotion through neglect and calculation. You can hold your nose and mark a ballot while simultaneously demanding better, building alternatives, refusing to let anyone mistake your pragmatism for permission to keep disappointing you. The Democratic Party is operating from an old playbook, one written before social media gave us unfiltered access to information, before movements could organize without institutional gatekeepers, before regular folks could speak truth directly to millions without needing permission from editors or party officials. They're still thinking in terms of captured audiences and limited choices, not realizing that we're having conversations they're not part of, building networks they don't control, imagining futures they haven't approved. And here's what really gets me, what really makes my soul ache with a mixture of frustration and hope. They think we don't see them making calculations about which communities are expendable, which issues can wait, which promises can be quietly shelved until more convenient times. They think we don't notice the pattern of who gets thrown under the bus when compromise is needed, whose rights become negotiating chips, whose suffering becomes acceptable collateral damage in the pursuit of some larger strategic goal that never quite materializes into concrete protection. But we notice everything now. We're tracking receipts. We're remembering who said what and when, who fought and who folded, who stood firm and who suddenly discovered the virtues of incrementalism when it was our lives on the line. And you know what we're learning? We're learning that sometimes the people who claim to be your only protection are really just managers of your oppression, offering to make the boot on your neck slightly more comfortable if you promise to stay still and keep quiet. That's a bitter lesson, but it's a liberating one too. Because once you stop believing that your survival depends entirely on someone else's benevolence, once you stop thinking that one political party owns your future, something remarkable happens. You start taking responsibility for your own liberation. You start organizing differently, thinking bigger, demanding more. You stop accepting crumbs and calling it progress. You stop letting fear of the right wing override justified anger at the people who claim to represent you, but consistently fail to protect you. You start building coalitions based on shared values rather than shared enemies, creating movements that can outlast election cycles and survive regardless of which party holds power. This is what they didn't anticipate. This is the variable they left out of their calculations. They thought they could let the threats pile up, could stand aside while attacks intensified, could watch our communities face increased danger and discrimination, and we'd panic our way back into their arms, grateful for whatever scraps of protection they deigned to offer. But what if we don't? What if instead we recognize that game for what it is and refuse to play? What if we build our own networks of mutual aid and collective defense? What if we show up at the polls when necessary, but invest our real energy and resources and hope into structures and movements and organizations that answer to us, not to donors or consultants or the endless calculation of political triangulation? That's the future they should fear, not our absence from their coalition, but our presence in movements they can't control or co-opt or take for granted. I want to be clear about something because clarity matters more than comfort right now. Recognizing these dynamics doesn't mean embracing political nihilism or pretending all options are equally harmful. It means developing the sophisticated analysis required to hold multiple truths simultaneously. Yes, there are material differences between political parties that affect real lives. Yes, those differences matter and can mean survival for vulnerable communities. And yes, we can acknowledge that truth while also refusing to give unconditional loyalty to people who've shown conditional commitment to our well-being. The Democratic establishment needs to understand something fundamental. You can't keep people through fear indefinitely. Eventually, even legitimate fears about external threats get outweighed by accumulated resentments about internal betrayals. Eventually, people choose dignity over safety, autonomy over protection, the uncertainty of building something new over the certainty of being disappointed again by something old. We're approaching that eventually now. Maybe we're already there. So here's my message to the powers that be, the strategists and consultants and party leaders who think they've got us figured out. We're not running back. We're not so desperate for your protection that we'll accept your neglect. We're not so afraid of what's coming that we'll forget what you failed to do, what you failed to be. You can let the storms come. You can calculate that our fear will drive us back to you, but you better understand something. You better hear this clearly. We've been through storms before, baby. We've survived worse than you can imagine, built beauty out of ashes you said would be our graves. We know how to weather hard times without you. The question is, do you know how to earn us back with you? That's the real question, the one that should keep them up at night. Not whether we'll come running back out of fear, but whether they'll finally realize that movements built on taking people for granted eventually crumble, that loyalty demanded rather than earned eventually exhausts itself, that communities disrespected long enough eventually walk away. And when we walk away, we don't go backward, we build forward. This is Lovayah, guest correspondent for African Diaspora News Channel, reminding you that your power doesn't belong to anyone who won't respect it, that your vote is yours to cast, but your allegiance is yours to give or withhold, and that sometimes the most radical thing you can do is refuse to be rescued by people who helped create the danger in the first place, Stay woke, stay discerning, and remember, fear is a feeling, but freedom is a practice. Peace and power, family. We're going to be all right with them or without them.